I wish to confess to being a huge fan of Galileo Galilei. Not that he cares, of course, he is long since dead. And also not because the Indigo Girls wrote a song about him. My fandom goes way back, my adoration since I was a child. But I learned something about this man this past spring when an article came out combining some of the studies of various scientists across the country. The first is Dr. Mark Leary from Duke University, who's been studying the role of people's beliefs and how this plays out in their behavior. He's a neuroscientist, and he's looking into what it means to admit that you could be wrong. This fact alone allows people to pay more attention to any evidence they encounter. And in fact, that is what Galileo did. You see, Galileo in his time and place was a product of his environment, and he grew up believing, as everyone else did, and then suddenly, with the facts he encountered, it was, oh man, I think we're wrong. Let's look at this a little more. And then to have the integrity to say, I think we're wrong. The earth is not the center of it all. And the article I was reading then discussed this work of Tanel Porter from Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. She's an educational psychologist, and her work asks students to rate the degree to which they tend to question their own beliefs, generally gauging how humble they are in their thinking. See, okay, so like I would say, is there a cow in church? And I would start to look. So if we can recognize our ideas about something, we might recognize we might be wrong. And we're more likely to do things to try and get things right. In short, being humble is this overlooked superpower in the educational system. You see, we want to have self-confidence, trusting our abilities or our qualities. That's a good thing, right? But we have to avoid overconfidence. By way of example, Leary, the Duke University guy, asked a sample of adults to just think back on any recent disagreement, and he asked them how often their positions had been the right one, just on average, right? So on average, we should be right 50% of the time, right? Even odds, maybe, okay? But also just think about, like, if you are a rock star in, say, baseball, what's that top batting average? You get it right a third of the time, right? So if you are just top of your game, you're getting it right a third. But you're asking people how often in a disagreement you are absolutely right, knowing that maybe you should be right about 50% of the time. A whopping 82%, more than 4 out of every 5 said they were right, oh, so much more than half of the time. They were overconfident, or they had overestimated their knowledge in their beliefs. Now, okay, this may not sound like a really big deal, we overestimate, but let's put it in perspective, because the study from Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, has this little fact out there about catastrophic decisions. Say in 1986, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration believed that the risk of loss for any single space shuttle flight was roughly 1 in 100,000. That overconfident belief may have been one of the things that led to the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger. We want to avoid overconfidence while still having self-confidence. You see, there's good news, though. He adds that there's a vaccine for overconfidence. It's the same one that Galileo had. It's recognizing that your beliefs could be wrong. And there's a fancy term for this. They call it intellectual humility. So I'm going to ask you, what do you see in this picture? It's a public domain picture. You've probably seen it, right? Do you see an elderly woman or do you see a young woman? Or do you see both? You see, this ambiguous picture is an example of how one image, one event or situation can appear to illustrate two different things, or perhaps more, depending on how you look at it. Intellectual humility, or perhaps, as Micah would say, walking humbly with our God, the only one who has that full, complete, and right perspective. Micah would ask us as God to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with God, or to enter into the parable which Kathy read so wonderfully just a short time ago. Let's remember that the workers who were hired first got this idea in their head, and they just assumed in their minds that they were right. You see, if the others who didn't work nearly as long as they did got paid a denarius, then of course, without checking the facts with anybody, they knew they were going to get more. They didn't ask any questions. They didn't check anything out. They were incredibly overconfident. They knew they would get more, even though evidence would have held a different truth. And the pain and the anger and disgruntlement that it caused was self-made. And isn't that sad? And I have another question for you. How many of you have heard this parable called the laborers in the vineyard? And if you haven't heard it called that, all you have to do is open the Bibles that are in front of you to Matthew 20, 1 through 6. And you can do that if you're bored by my sermon, and that's okay, because what you'll see is that a human titled this parable, The Laborers of the Vineyard. Jesus didn't title it that. We did. Why didn't we title it The Amazingly Gracious Vineyard Owner or The Perplexing Payout? Because whenever we give something a title, we're already interpreting it, giving a bit of sway over how we're going to read it. You see, what if you don't want to enter this parable from the perspective of the laborers? Jesus didn't tell you to enter the parable that way. He just told a parable. And parables allow the hearer to enter it from any perspective, any point of view. There's not a right way to enter a parable. A parable, like the transcendent realm of God, meets us where we are, and it enters us and we enter it. It could be this week that wherever you are to hear this story like you're the vineyard owner. What if you hear this story because you're being called to maybe do or live out justice and love in this radical way? Maybe you're meant to hear it as if it is a financial edge for you. One where you're being called to live out something financially over the top by ways of the standards of others. A parable can be seen that way, especially this one. Or what if this time It's meant to encounter you, to hear this word of grace, this powerful word of grace. This parable speaks to that. It speaks to equal needs and having those needs met daily. How are you entering in, and from what perspective? You can enter in from the laborers. That's a perfectly wonderful way to enter in. Maybe you're entering in hearing this word of grateful thankfulness. Are we being called to check our entitlement a little bit? Our judgmentalness a little bit? It could be. Are we being asked to be just as ready to extend the gifts of grace as we are to receive the gifts of grace? How do you hear the parable? How do you hear that parable? And when you hear it, do you hear it with intellectual humility? Amen.